The royal gala was meant to be a night of polished smiles, glittering protocol, and carefully rehearsed unity. But within minutes of Camilla's unexpected arrival, Princess Anne stood from her seat, turned away from the room, and walked out in full view of stunned guests. It was not a misunderstanding. It was not a quiet disagreement. It was a public rupture no one inside the palace could soften. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The room felt frozen, because a royal gala, a formal gathering arranged to show national service and family unity, depends on order more than emotion, and that order had just cracked in front of everyone. Anne had arrived believing the guest list was final, believing the evening had been built to steady the crown after weeks of private tension, believing no one would use ceremony to force an answer the family had not yet agreed to give. Then the queen consort entered, calm at first, her place near the senior royal table already prepared, and Anne understood the truth before anyone said it aloud. Someone had known, someone had decided, someone had kept her outside the decision, until the moment refusal would look like rebellion. Charles saw the change in her face before she moved, and the king tightened his hand against the edge of his chair as if he could hold the night together by force alone. He could not. Anne rose with a stillness more dangerous than anger, and the scrape of her chair cut through the gala's careful warmth like a verdict. Camilla expected recognition, perhaps even acceptance, but she received silence so heavy it stripped the evening of its shine. The monarch looked toward William, and the prince did not rush forward, because he had already seen what others had missed. The sealed place card beside her setting, placed with quiet intention, proof that this arrival had not been accidental. That small card turned a surprise into a message, and that message turned Anne's restraint into something impossible to ignore. The future king watched her leave, not as a woman losing control, but as a royal drawing a boundary no speech could soften. Charles understood then that the walkout had exposed more than one hidden seating change. It had revealed a fracture the palace had spent weeks trying to cover with smiles, music, and polished silver. Camilla remained seated, wounded by the rejection, yet trapped by the very entrance meant to restore her standing. Anne did not look back, and that made the silence worse. But to understand why one arrival could make Anne abandon an entire royal evening, the story must turn to the people sitting inside that room, and the wounds each of them carried. Every royal crisis has a public moment, but its real force comes from private history. Anne was not simply walking away from Camilla. She was walking away from years of swallowed restraint, hidden resentments, and palace decisions made behind closed doors. Charles saw duty slipping from his control. William saw danger. And Camilla saw, in one devastating instant, that acceptance could not be forced by seating charts. Anne's reputation had never been built on drama. It had been built on discipline, service, and a sharp loyalty that rarely needed explaining, which made her walkout feel less like emotion and more like judgment. A senior royal table, the main place where the most important family members are seated at a formal event, carries meaning far beyond comfort or convenience, and Camilla's position near that table made her arrival look approved, planned, and protected.
Anne had come believing the gala would honor service after weeks of family strain, not become another stage for internal politics. That was why the betrayal cut so deeply. She could have endured a difficult evening. She could have endured awkward silence.
But she could not endure being cornered into accepting a decision hidden from her until the room was already watching. Camilla felt the humiliation instantly, because the queen consort had entered expecting a careful return to recognition, only for Anne's departure to turn that hope into a public rejection before she could even speak. Charles looked trapped between the woman beside him and the sister who had just walked away, and the king knew the crisis had moved beyond manners. This was now about authority. It was about who had the right to place Camilla back at the heart of royal life, without warning those who would have to stand beside her. William kept his face controlled, but the prince's silence was not weakness. He leaned toward an aide and asked who authorized the final seating change. The aide lowered his eyes, and that small refusal answered more than words could. "Sophie," seated close enough to sense the danger, watched the future king absorb it. Then the trusted confidant whispered that Anne had warned the palace about this exact scenario days earlier. William turned slightly, not shocked by the warning itself, but by the fact that someone had ignored it. Charles saw that reaction, and the monarch understood the night was slipping further from his hands. Camilla remained still, but she knew the room had changed. Anne's empty place had become an accusation, and no one could pretend it was only about a chair. That warning had not come from nowhere, because behind the gala stood one earlier incident that had turned discomfort into open resistance. Long before the gala doors opened, one private ceremony had changed everything. It was not loud, it was not public. But inside a closed Windsor room, Anne had watched a gesture unfold that convinced her Camilla was being quietly restored to influence without the family's full consent. From that moment, the Princess Royal stopped seeing small choices as accidents. She began seeing a pattern. Anne had entered that earlier gathering with no suspicion, only duty. The Windsor Service Medal Ceremony, a private palace event meant to honor staff who had served the crown for many years, was supposed to be simple, respectful, and untouched by family politics. Charles stood at the front as the king, prepared to thank people whose loyalty had held the institution together through grief, scandal, and change. Then Camilla was brought forward to stand beside him, not as a guest, not as a quiet supporter, but as someone placed near the center of gratitude and authority. Anne felt the meaning before anyone explained it. The staff were being honored, yet the moment seemed to carry another message. The queen consort was being returned to influence through ceremony, and no one had asked whether the family was ready to stand behind that signal. Charles noticed Anne's stillness, and knew she had understood more than the room wanted to admit. Afterward, away from the softened voices and formal thanks, she confronted him, in a private exchange, later preserved in a documented account by a senior household secretary. Anne told him that service should never be used as cover for a political restoration. She told the monarch that if Camilla was to be placed back at the heart of royal life, the family deserved honesty before symbolism. Charles felt cornered, because he knew the decision had not been fully discussed with William, and Sophie had only learned of it after the ceremony began. The king promised there would be no more surprises. He said the family would be consulted. He said Camilla's role would not be forced through side doors and polished events. Anne accepted the words, but not with comfort. She accepted them as a warning recorded in her own mind. So when the gala arrived, and Camilla entered unexpectedly, and the place near the senior table had already been prepared, Anne did not see a mistake. She saw the promise broken in public. The queen consort's arrival was not just an entrance anymore. It was the same pattern returning, bolder than before. Charles saw recognition harden across Anne's face, and the monarch knew the past had walked into the room with Camilla. And once that broken promise stood before her in human form, Anne did not choose silence. She chose confrontation. The walkout was only the beginning. Beyond the closed doors of the gala hall, the real confrontation unfolded in a narrow private corridor where the noise of the evening fell away. Anne stopped only when Charles called her name. Camilla followed moments later, shaken but determined. For the first time that night, the royal mask slipped, and the argument became painfully human. Anne did not turn quickly. She let the silence sit between them, and that silence did more damage than rage. Charles reached her first, carrying the weight of the king, but speaking like a brother who knew he had failed to stop the wound before it opened. A formal toast, the first planned speech of a royal evening, is meant to set the tone for the whole event, and Anne had left before it could even begin. That was why the crisis became instant. This was no private disagreement hidden after dinner. This was a ceremonial evening thrown into disorder before the monarchy could even pretend everything was fine. Camilla stepped closer, refusing to remain inside, as if she were guilty by presence alone. Yet the queen consort's confidence shook when Anne finally looked at her. Charles asked Anne to return. The monarch said the room was watching, the guests were waiting, and the family could still contain the damage. Anne's answer was cold, because it was controlled. She told him she had been deceived. Not surprised, not inconvenienced. Deceived. The king's face tightened, because that word did not accuse a schedule. It accused a system. Camilla insisted she had not arrived to provoke anyone, and the queen consort said she had been told her attendance was understood. Anne did not soften. She said nothing at first, and that quiet made Camilla feel smaller than any public insult could have. Charles then admitted he had approved Camilla's attendance, but claimed he had not approved the final seating arrangement beside the senior royal table. Anne's eyes hardened. She told the monarch that approval and ignorance could not stand together when the crown was being used to send messages. If he approved the return, he owned the meaning. If he did not know the details, he had lost control of the people acting in his name. Camilla heard the blow land, and for the first time, she understood Anne's anger was not only personal, it was about power. It was about trust. It was about being forced to accept a decision after the room had already been arranged around it. Then William appeared at the corridor entrance, still calm, but visibly changed by what he had heard. The prince arrived just as Camilla asked Anne whether she wanted her erased from royal life entirely. That question forced everyone to face the deeper truth. This was not about one chair at one gala, but about who still held power inside the crown. The palace moved quickly, but not calmly. While guests waited behind closed doors, a small circle of aides gathered around the seating plan that had triggered the crisis. A name had been moved. A place card had been printed. A royal arrival had been concealed until the final hour. And somewhere between those choices, someone had gambled that Anne would accept what she had already warned she would reject. William stood over the paper with a stillness that made the aides nervous, because the prince understood how dangerous one quiet change could become when it carried royal meaning. A seating plan, the written arrangement showing where each guest sits at a formal event, is never just about chairs inside the palace. It shows rank, trust, and who is being placed near power. Camilla had first been listed for a side reception placement, distant enough to be respectful, but not central. Then the final chart moved the queen consort close to Charles and the senior family members, turning her arrival into a public signal that she had been accepted again at the heart of royal life. William felt anger rise, not because Camilla had attended, but because the change made Anne look harsh when she had actually been kept in the dark. Charles stared at the file and felt command slipping from his hands. The king knew silence could now look like permission, and permission could look like strategy. Sophie reached for the seating file before anyone stopped her, and the trusted confidant saw the detail that changed the room. A handwritten amendment had been added near Camilla's name. It did not carry the mark of the event committee, the group responsible for arranging guests and timings. It came from a private office, which meant someone close to the center of authority had pushed the change outside normal channels. William asked who received the instruction. No one answered at first. Then one aide, pale and careful, admitted in a recorded internal briefing that the change had been made late in the afternoon, and Anne's office had not been informed. That admission cut through every excuse. Charles closed his eyes for a moment, because the monarch understood what it meant. Camilla's place had been moved, Anne had been left unaware, and the gala had been allowed to become a trap dressed as ceremony. Sophie looked toward William, waiting to see whether he would protect the image of the evening or the truth of what had happened. The prince folded the paper once, slowly, and said Anne would not be blamed for a decision she had been denied the chance to challenge. Charles heard the line and knew the future king had chosen. But while the palace searched for control behind the scenes, the consequences were already spreading through the gala, like fire under a locked door. Inside the gala hall, the empty chair became louder than any speech. Guests stopped pretending not to notice. The first toast was delayed, then rewritten, then quietly removed. Camilla sat rigidly, her expression fixed, while Charles returned without Anne beside him. The monarchy had survived scandals before, but this was different. This was not an attack from outside. This was refusal from within. Camilla felt every whisper move across the room like judgment, and the queen consort knew each glance carried the same silent question. Had her arrival caused Anne to leave? Charles lowered himself back into his seat with the weight of a man who had returned without control. and the king understood the public dignity of the evening had already collapsed. An opening toast, the first formal speech of a gala, is meant to guide the mood of the night and tell guests what the event represents. This one had been written to celebrate unity and service, two words that now felt impossible with Anne's chair empty and the family divided before the first glass had been raised. Palace staff moved quickly, removing part of the printed program and whispering changes to nervous presenters, but confusion spread faster than order. Guests who had expected a formal tribute now watched aides cross the room with tight faces and lowered voices. William saw the danger at once. The prince knew the palace machine would be tempted to protect itself with a softer story, one that claimed Anne had left because of illness, exhaustion, or a sudden duty elsewhere. He stopped that before it began. In a recorded instruction later noted by the communications office, William told aides not to issue any false explanation. Anne would not be made into a problem simply because the truth was uncomfortable. Charles heard the decision and did not challenge it, because the monarch knew the future king was right. Camilla remained still, but the queen consort could feel the evening slipping away from her as surely as Anne had. Meanwhile, Sophie searched beyond the hall and found Anne in a private anteroom, still holding her gloves, calm in the way people become calm when the decision has already cost them something. The trusted confidant asked whether she wanted the palace to say anything. Anne said no, not yet. She would speak to William before anyone else, because he needed to know exactly what had been broken, and why it could not be repaired with a careful statement. Sophie understood then that the walkout was no longer only a reaction. It was becoming testimony. That private conversation would become the turning point, because away from the gala and the machinery of the palace, Anne finally said what she had been holding back. The turning point did not come with shouting. It came in a small private room, where Anne and William sat without aids, statements, or protection from the truth. The prince expected anger. Instead, he found exhaustion. Anne did not ask for revenge. She asked for honesty. And in that quiet exchange, the future king understood that the walkout had not weakened the monarchy. It had exposed what needed saving. William closed the door himself, and that simple act mattered because it removed the palace machine from the conversation. No aids, no rewritten lines, no careful faces waiting to turn pain into policy. Anne sat across from him, still carrying the heaviness of the gala, and the prince saw that her anger had already burned down into something sadder. A palace mediation, the private process where officials guide royal disputes toward a controlled answer, would have softened the truth until no one could feel its edge. William did not want that. Anne did not want it either. She told him her walkout had never been meant to embarrass Charles. It had been meant to stop a pattern. Decisions were being hidden until resistance became impossible, and then loyalty was used as a cage. William looked down because the words struck him harder than accusation. He had sensed the tension around Camilla's return. He had seen the careful movements, the sudden changes, the quiet attempts to bring the queen consort back toward the center. But the prince had waited, hoping the family could avoid a direct break. Now the break had happened anyway. Anne admitted, in a private recorded conversation kept by her office secretary, that sadness had sat beneath her anger from the beginning. She said loyalty becomes painful when it is treated like silence. William did not interrupt. The future king watched her reach into a small folder and place one page on the table. It was her private warning to Charles after the Windsor Service Medal ceremony, the earlier event where Camilla had been placed beside the king during an internal staff honor. Anne had kept a copy because she had known the promise might one day matter. William read it slowly. Then he set it down with care, as if the paper itself carried the weight of the night. Anne had not acted impulsively. She had warned them. She had waited. She had finally walked out only when the same pattern returned in front of everyone. William's guilt changed into resolve. He told Anne the family would issue an honest internal directive before any public statement, one that would stop ceremony from being used to force agreement. Anne nodded once, not relieved, but heard. But honesty inside the palace would not be enough, because by morning, the world outside had already turned Anne's walkout into a national symbol. By sunrise, the gala was no longer a private royal disaster. It belonged to the country. The image that captured everything was brutally simple. One newspaper front page showed the glittering senior table, with Anne's chair empty and Camilla seated nearby, the headline declaring, "The chair that spoke." In that single image, the public understood what the palace had tried to contain. Camilla sat alone the next morning with that front page in her hands, and the queen consort read the headline twice, before folding the paper once and placing it aside. She did not need anyone to explain the damage. Media coverage, the public reporting and discussion that shapes how people understand an event, had turned one empty chair into a symbol of royal resistance. The story was no longer about gowns, speeches, or gala guests. It was about trust. It was about whether Anne had walked away from a dinner or from a decision forced onto her without warning. Charles listened to the morning broadcasts with sorrow instead of anger, because the king knew Anne's silence had become louder than any palace statement. Broadcasters framed the walkout as a rare sign that internal royal discipline had reached its breaking point, and that mattered because the monarchy depends on the appearance of unity even when private emotions are strained. Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered near the gates, quiet at first, then growing louder as cameras arrived. One handwritten sign carried the words, "Anne walked for the truth," and that single message gave the public mood a voice. Camilla saw the image later and looked away, not because she hated Anne, but because she understood that the queen consort had become the face of a wound she did not fully control. Charles heard aides discuss possible language, but the monarch refused to let them blame illness or scheduling pressure. William's influence was already clear. The palace released a restrained statement confirming a review of gala arrangements, and that phrase mattered, because a review means an official check into how decisions were made, not a denial that anything happened. The prince had made sure the wording did not erase Anne's choice. It did not accuse her. It did not protect everyone else at her expense. Sophie read the statement and knew the trusted confidant was seeing the first sign that the family had stopped running from the truth. Anne remained quiet, but her quiet no longer felt isolated. It had crossed the gates, entered the headlines, and forced the crown to face itself. The world had chosen its meaning, but inside the monarchy, one final decision still had to define what the walkout would become. In the end, the walkout was not remembered as a scandal of bad manners. It became the night Princess Anne forced the monarchy to admit that unity cannot be staged while trust is being broken. Camilla's arrival exposed the wound, Anne's departure revealed its depth, and William's response gave the family a way to survive the damage without pretending it had never happened. Anne did not return to the gala that night, and that choice became the final truth no palace statement could erase. The next family meeting was quieter than the crisis itself, but far more important. Charles accepted responsibility for allowing confusion around Camilla's role to grow until it broke into public view, and the king understood that leadership meant more than approving appearances. It meant protecting trust before ceremony demanded obedience. A senior royal placement, the formal position given to a major family member at an important event, would never again be altered without direct consultation with those affected. That decision mattered because the monarchy survives on symbols, and one changed chair had nearly turned loyalty into surrender. William's internal directive, a private written order guiding how the family would handle major ceremonial decisions, confirmed that unity could no longer be staged while emotional agreement was being forced behind closed doors. The prince did not punish Camilla, and he did not excuse the mistake. He drew a line. Camilla accepted, painfully, that presence alone could not rebuild trust, and the queen consort's humiliation became a turning point rather than a weapon. Anne did not apologize for leaving, but in a private conversation documented by a household secretary, she acknowledged to Charles that the pain of the evening had touched everyone, including him. The monarch heard that and finally understood the difference between defiance and warning. Sophie later told Anne, in a private interview recorded for the family archive, that the walkout had stopped a deeper betrayal from being buried under protocol. The trusted confidant was right. Anne had not weakened royal discipline, she had restored its meaning. Charles looked older after the gala, but clearer. William looked less hesitant, because the future king had learned that silence can protect peace for a moment and destroy trust for years. Camilla stepped back from forced symbolism, and Anne stood firm without turning the wound into revenge. The monarchy emerged bruised but clearer. Loyalty is not obedience without truth, and unity is not a performance staged over broken promises. And so the gala that began with an unexpected arrival ended with a permanent lesson. The crown can survive embarrassment, but it cannot survive trust being broken in silence. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.